century. Naipol's works often explore themes of displacement, identity, colonialism, and the human condition, and with a particular focus on the experiences of individuals, mostly during the post colonial societies. His writing style is noted for his sharp observations, complex characterizations, and often bleak view of humanity. Naipaul was born in Trinidad to a family of Indian immigrants and later moved to England, where he attended Oxford University. His early life in Trinidad, marked by cultural displacement and a sense of alienation, deeply influenced his writing. And his extensive travels across the Caribbean, Africa, India, sometimes to the Middle East, also shaped his perspectives and the themes he explored in his works. Some of the most important works that Naipal has written is A House for Mr. Biswas. This is what we are going to study today. Is a very famous novel. It explores the struggles of an Indo-Trinidadian man striving to assert his independence and identity by building his own house. He's also written In a Free State. He's also written The Enigma of Arrival, A Bend in the River, An Area of Darkness. These are few of his important books. Let's start with our novel today. This is A House for Mr. Biswas. The title is deeply symbolic and serves as a central theme about the novel written by B.S. Naipaul. The phrase a house represents much more than just a physical structure. It encapsulates the protagonist's Mohan Biswas' lifelong quest for autonomy, dignity, and identity. The house becomes a metaphor for Mr. Biswas' aspirations, his desire to carve out of a place in the world where he can be his own master, free from the control of others. The house as a phrase also is a symbolical theme towards autonomy and identity. Mr. Biswas owning a house is synonymous with achieving independence. You'll find throughout the novel he is portrayed as a man who constantly struggles against the constraints imposed upon him by the society, his in laws. We will call the in laws as the Tulsi family, and his own circumstances. Born in poverty and facing a series of misfortunes, Mr. Biswas is a character who has never truly had control over his life. His early life is marked by a series of displacements. He shuffled from one place to another, never able to establish a sense of permanence or stability. The house therefore symbolizes Mr. Biswas' desire to assert his identity in a world that often tries to diminish or erase it. By owning a house, he hopes to escape the oppressive influence of the Tulsi family, who embody traditional hierarchical values that stifle individuality. The house represents a space where Mr. Vishwas can express himself freely without being subjected to the authority or expectations of others. It is his way of reclaiming agency over his life, of saying that he is more than just a dependent or a subordinate. House phrase is also symbolic towards the dream of stability and security. We'll find throughout the novel the house um, asserts two things notably absent from Mr. Vishwa's life. His childhood was marked by instability. His family was impoverished and often at the mercy of others for shelter. As an adult, his marriage to Shama brings him into Tulsi family, where he feels even more insecure and marginalized. Tulsi's communal living arrangement, particularly in the Hanuman house, is claustrophobic and controlling, leaving Mr. Vishwas yearning for a space of his own. The pursuit of a house here represents Mr. Vishwas' hope for a stable, secured future for himself and his children. It is not just a personal goal, but also a legacy that he wants to leave behind, a tangible proof of his existence and his efforts. The house, in this sense, becomes a symbol of his desire to provide his family with a sense of permanence and protection, something that he never had. This phrase house can also be symbolic of the illusion and a reality, where we find that the novel keeps on representing a kind of illusion or an unattainable dream. Mr. Vishwa's quest for a house is fraught with setbacks and disappointments. His attempts to build or purchase a house are often met with failure, reflecting the harsh realities of life and the difficulty of achieving one's dreams, especially in a post colonial context where economic and social forces are often stacked against the individual. When Mr. Vishwas finally does get a home or a house, it is far from the ideal that he had imagined. The house is small, poorly constructed, located in less than their desirable neighborhood. Yet, despite all its flaws, the house represents a significant achievement for Mr. Vishwas. It is a physical manifestation of his years of struggle and persistence. The house, although imperfect, is real, and this is his, a testament to his determination and resilience. On a broader level, the house also symbolizes the post colonial struggle for identity and self determination. Mr. Vishwa's quest for a house can be seen as a metaphor for the larger quest of post colonial societies to establish their own identities and independence in the wake of colonialism. Just as Mr. Vishwas seeks to build a house that is truly his own, post colonial nations seek to build identities and futures that are not dictated by colonial powers. The challenges Mr. Vishwas faces, economic hardships, social expectations, and cultural pressures, mirrors the challenges faced by these newly independent nations as they attempt to navigate the complexities of identity, autonomy, and progress. The house, therefore, becomes a symbol of both personal and collective aspirations, as well as the difficulties inherent in realizing those aspirations. The title, A House for Mr. Vishwas, talks about the central conflict of the novel, the struggle for personal independence and identity in a world that often seeks to deny it. The house represents Mr. Vishwas' deepest desires for autonomy, stability, security, and recognition. His quest to assert his place in the world, to leave a legacy, and to find a sense of belonging. A House for Mr. Vishwas consists of two parts, and there are 13 chapters in total. First, chapter 1 to 6 is the first part, and 7 onwards is part 2. Novel is divided into these sections to depict different phases of Mr. Vishwas' life, with each chapter focusing on the key events and developments in his journey towards achieving independence and owning his own house. Each part comprises chapters that are chronicle to the life of the protagonist, Mr. Mohan Viswas, and his quest for independence and a house of his own. Let's do the character analysis. We have few characters here, important ones. Mohan Viswas, he is the protagonist of the novel. Mr. Vishwas is a man of complex emotions and aspirations. He's determined, he's stubborn, he's resentful of the circumstances that seem to conspire against him. His quest for a house symbolizes his desire for autonomy and self respect. Despite his flaws and frequent failures, Mr. Vishwas' determination makes him a very sympathetic character, embodying the struggle for dignity and identity in a post colonial context. Then we meet his wife, Shama. She is a member of the Tulsi family. She is depicted as a loyal to family and often conflicted between her duty to them and her obligations to her husband. Shama's relationship with Mr. Vishwas is complex, characterized by both affection and tension. Over time, she grows more supportive of Mr. Vishwas, and their relationship, while never ideal, deepens into mutual respect. Then we meet the Tulsi family. The Tulsis here represent the traditional, the hierarchical, and the collectivists' values of the Indo Trinidadian community. They are a large, powerful family that exerts considerable influence over Mr. Vishwa's family. The family is matriarchal, with Mrs. Tulsi wielding significant power. The Tulsis embody the social and cultural pressures that Mr. Vishwas seeks to escape. Mrs. Tulsi here is another important character, the matriarch of the Tulsi family. She is a very controlling figure who represents the traditional values that Mr. Vishwas rebels against. She is manipulative and often uses her influence to maintain control over her family and Mr. Vishwas. Then we meet Seth. Seth is Mrs. Tulsi's brother in law and the family's main provider. He plays a significant role in managing the family business affairs and is often at odds with Mr. Viswas, whom he views as a troublemaker. These are the important characters. We go now to the plot. The plot is very simple, uh, relatable. A house for Mr. Viswas. It's the story of Mr. Mohan Viswas, who from his birth seems destined for failure. The novel traces his life's journey from childhood to adulthood, highlighting his many struggles, including his tumultuous marriage, his challenging relationships with his in laws, his relentless pursuit of owning a house. A plot is structured around Mr. Vishwa's attempt to assert his independence and identity, often in the face of adversity and disappointment. The novel opens with Mr. Vishwa's death, then flashes back to recount the key events of his life. Born into poverty, Mr. Vishwas faces a series of misfortunes, from being blamed for his father's death to being coerced into a marriage with Shama, a member of the domineering Tulsi family. His relationship with the Tulsis is fraught with tension as they often undermine his attempts to assert himself. Throughout the novel, Mr. Viswas makes several attempts to secure a house of his own, each reflecting his desire to escape the control of the Tulsis and establish his own identity. His final success in acquiring a house, though it is modest and in poor condition, represents a personal victory and the culmination of his life efforts. After the plot, we now come to the symbols used. The symbols, mostly central symbol of the novel, is the house that Mr. Vishwas is desiring to establish a place for, where he can belief that he belongs to and can control his own destiny. There is the Tulsi home as a symbol, that is the Hanuman house. The Tulsi's family's residence, that is also called as the Hanuman house. It symbolizes the oppressive and the collectivist nature of Tulsi family. It is a place where individuality is suppressed in favor of tradition and communal living. Then mostly there is this writing desk which symbolizes Mr. Vishwa's intellectual aspirations and his desire to assert his voice. Writing is one of the few ways Mr. Vishwas can express his individuality, and the desk represents his attempts to carve out a space for himself in a world that often silences him. Water is another important symbol that frequently appears in the novel as a symbol of both life and destruction. It is associated with key moments in Vishwa's life, including the death of his father and the flooding of the house he builds. Water represents the uncontrollable forces that shape Mr. Vishwa's life, reflecting the larger theme of the unpredictability and hardships of existence. Let's start with chapter 1. Chapter 1, it's pastoral, and this chapter is rich with significant paragraphs that establish the foundation for the novel's exploration of identity, autonomy, and the struggles of its protagonist, Mr. Mohan Biswas. 10 weeks premature, the seventh and last child, a boy, was born. He was small and sickly and brought down by many illness, and this added to his mother's grief. He was named Mohan, but it was understood that his fate was not good and the name was not much used. This passage occurs at the beginning of the novel where Mr. Vishwa's birth is described in a grim tone. The chapter outlines the various superstitions surrounding his birth, including the belief that he would bring bad luck. This passage sets the stage for Mr. Vishwa's life as one filled with hardships and challenges. The description of his premature birth and the foreboding sense of doom that surrounds him foreshadows the struggles he will face throughout his life. Naipaul uses this passage to illustrate that the sense of fatalism that permeates Mr. Vishwa's life from the very beginning. It also establishes the theme of identity and how external forces such as superstitions, societal expectations can shape a person's sense of self. Now, what does the writer wants to convey here? Naipul's major objective here in this passage is to highlight the deterministic forces that influence Mr. Vishwa's life by emphasizing the inauspicious circumstances of his birth. Naipul critiques the ways in which individuals are often constrained by societal and familial expectations. The author aims to evoke empathy in the reader for Mr. Vishwas here, portraying him as a character who must constantly struggle against the forces that seek to define and limit him. The next text. The Pandit who read the stars at Mohan Vishwas' birth said that the boy was born in the wrong way at the wrong time and should have been born in a different family. Born in the wrong way. Look at this particular phrase. This particular passage is crucial as it introduces the inauspicious circumstances of Mr. Vishwa's birth. The phrase born in the wrong way sets the tone for Mr. Vishwa's life, which is characterized with uneven struggles against society, against family expectations. The Pandit's prediction tells about the lifelong battle Mr. Vishwas will face against the views of the society, where fate and destiny are often seen as inescapable forces. If we focus more into the thoughts of what might have caused the author to write it in this way, you would understand uh, astrology and superstition played a very significant role in shaping people's life, mostly in the Indo Trinidadian community. By emphasizing this, that Mr. Vishwas was born in the wrong way, the author sets up the central conflict of the novel. So much of struggle that he is going to assert in the upcoming times, his individuality, and how he breaks free from the constraints. These are all imposed by his birth and upbringing. This is what the author wants to convey. His father drank and gambled, and his mother constantly worried about money. So it was natural that Mr. Vishwas should have grown up to be a man who was never to have any money. Focusing on this passage, we see the poverty and the instability that marks Mr. Vishwas' early life. The reference here is towards his father's vices and his mother's anxiety about money that creates a picture of a household devoid of financial security and emotional stability. Mr. Vishwa's lack of money becomes a recurring motif throughout the novel, and this symbolizes clearly his lack of control over his circumstances, his desperate desire to move away from this situation. The author is clear enough to underscore the socio-economic challenges that shapes Mr. Vishwa's identity and motivation by depicting Mr. Vishwas as a man who was never to have any money. The author here clearly emphasizes the cyclical nature of poverty and difficulty of breaking free from its grasp. The author's objective here is to portray the harsh reality of life for those at the lower end of the social spectrum in post colonial societies where financial insecurity often dictates one's opportunities and self worth. Next line. He was to be a wanderer without a home, a man without a mission or purpose, always dependent on the charity of others. How significant is this line, where the line speaks about Mr. Vishwa's existential predicament? The description of him as a wanderer without a home foreshadows his lifelong quest for stability and a place of his own. The idea of being without a mission or a purpose highlights Mr. Vishwa's struggle to define his identity and find meaning in the world that seems indifferent to his existence. Naipul here portrays Mr. Vishwas as a wanderer, and he wants to reflect the broader theme of displacement as experienced by many people in post colonial societies. Here, the author aims to explore the psychological and the emotional toll of living in a world where one feels rootless and marginalized. By emphasizing Mr. Vishwa's dependency on others, Naipul also critiques the social structures that perpetuate his sense of helplessness and lack of agency. From the moment of his birth, Mr. Vishwas was set against the world. His rebellion began as a baby who screamed too much, and it continued in school, where he learned to question everything. Now, this passage is also important because it introduces how Mr. Vishwas' rebellious nature, which becomes a defining aspect of his character, which will be clearly seen in the upcoming chapters. His resistance to authority and societal norms is evident from a young age, and this rebellious streak drives much of the novel's action. Mr. Vishwa's questioning of everything he is taught reflects his desire to carve out of his own identity and reject the roles imposed on him by his family and society. Here, the author highlights the theme of individualism and the struggle for self determination. By portraying Mr. Vishwas as a natural born rebel, here Naipal emphasizes the significance of questioning established norms and the pursuit of personal freedom. Naipal's objective is to illustrate the difficulties and rewards of forging one's path in a world that often discourages deviation from the norm. This rebellion is both the source of Mr. Vishwa's strength and a cause of his suffering, as it isolates him from the very community he seeks to escape. End of chapter 1, we understand that the foundation of the novel's exploration of identity, autonomy, and the struggles of the individual against societal constraints. Naipal sets it clearly. He uses the moments to establish Mr. Vishwa's character and the central conflicts that will drive the narrative. The objective of the author here is to depict the challenges of self determination in a world that is often hostile to those who seek to define their own destinies. Moving ahead to chapter 2, where the name is Before the Tulsis. Chapter 2 is titled Before the Tulsis, which talks about the early life of Mr. Mohan Viswas, where he's exploring his upbringing, family dynamics, and the events that shapes his character. This chapter provides crucial background information on Mr. Vishwa's formative years, his strained relationship with his family, and his early experiences of struggle. This chapter sets the stage for the rest of the novel by highlighting the challenges and disappointments that Mr. Vishwas faces from a very young age, which ultimately fuel his lifelong quest for independence and a sense of belonging. Let's start with the chapters, lines of the chapter. From the moment of his birth, the world was in conspiracy to keep him in his place. And this opening line of the chapter talks about the central theme of Mr. Vishwa's life, the idea that he is destined to struggle against forces that seek to limit his potential and autonomy. Mr. Vishwas faces throughout his life, and the author uses this concept to underscore the sense of inevitability that permeates the entire novel. Shama's brothers, spitting on their fingers, smoothed down the edges of their moustache. A man must be able to control his wife, one said. Now, this passage highlights the patriarchal values that dominate the society in which Mr. Viswas lives. The emphasis on controlling one's wife reflects the rigid gender roles and expectations placed upon men and women. The mention of Shama's brothers and their behavior here talks about the toxic masculinity that pervades the community, where dominance and control are seen as essential traits for men. This scene foreshadows the difficulties Mr. Vishwas will face in his marriage to Shama, as well as his broader struggles with the Tulsi family, who embody these oppressive values. It was not that they hated him, it was simply that they could not help thinking of him as unlucky. Now, this line reflects the way Mr. Vishwas is perceived by others, particularly his family. The notion of being unlucky becomes a defining characteristic for Mr. Vishwas, shaping his identity and the way others interact with him. This perception of bad luck contributes to his sense of alienation and fuels his desire to prove himself and escape the limitations imposed on him. Naipal uses this idea to explore themes of identity, fate, and the psychological impact of societal labels. As of now, I would want to ask all of you what are your views regarding the character, the main protagonist? What are your views? How do you find the main character? Can somebody say? How do you find the main character? Mr. Vishwas, as of now, whatever you have heard about him, how do you frame this character in your mind? Yes, Shireen, would you want to add? A very complex character. Yukti, what makes you think Mr. Vishwas is a complex character? Will much appreciate if other listeners also give their answers. It's very important to know how you take, how you perceive the characters here. Meanwhile, Yukti, I think Yukti, are you? I think you are typing your answer. So you can give your answers here. What makes you think that he is rebellious and knows what he wants? Okay, fine. So you think that means he has a clarity of his purpose. Okay, good. Thank you, Yukti. We'll move ahead. So the last line we come to see that how people perceive him as unlucky and how this particular characteristics of being unlucky has actually defined him. This has shaped his identity and people, the way they interact with him. Now, this perception of bad luck contributes to a lot to his, you know, belief towards his or his desire to prove himself and escape the limitations that are imposed on him. But for him, it was not only a question of escape, it was also a question of establishing himself, finding a place in the world, and proving to everyone, and especially to himself, that he was not an unfortunate as they thought. Now, this passage captures Mr. Vishwas' motivation and the internal struggle, his desire to establish himself and find a place in the world speaks about his need for validation and recognition. The quest for a house here becomes symbolic of his broader search for identity, independence, and self worth. Naipal here emphasizes the psychological burden that Mr. Biswas carries as he seeks to defy the negative perception of others and assert his own agency. This passage highlights the novel's exploration of themes like self determination and the pursuit of dignity. He was not in rebellion, he was only trying to create a world in which he could live and from which he could improve, from which he could remove all the painful memories of his childhood. That means there is underlining a series of traumatic events. He is not recovered from it. And this passage provides insight into Mr. Vishwa's motivations and the emotional underpinnings of his actions. He wants to create a world, the phrase create a world free from the painful memories of his past talks about the deep impact of his upbringing on his psyche. Mr. Vishwa's quest for a house and a stable life is not just about material security, it is also about emotional healing and the need to distance himself from the trauma of his early years. Naipal uses this passage to explore the theme of memory and its role in shaping identity and personal ambition. As we move ahead here, I would like to ask all of you, what do you mean by emotional healing? You can type it down in the message section as we proceed, and in between, I'll come and check your answers. My question was, how do you think if Mr. Vishwas finds a home or a house for his own, he would receive an emotional healing, and what exactly emotional healing mean? So let's go to the next chapter. This was chapter 2, where we come to know that the author provides a deeper understanding of Mr. Vishwa's character and the forces that drive him. The chapter 2 delves into the psychological impact of childhood experiences. There is a detailed characterization and thematic exploration. The author presents a poignant and insightful commentary of the human condition here in chapter 2. Moving to chapter 3, the title is The Tulsis. Here we meet the Tulsis or the great Tulsi family. Let's try to understand the concept of the Hanuman house or the Tulsi family. A significant force in Mr. Vishwas' life, Tulsi family. That is what the author has introduced the reader to. Now, in this chapter, we focus on Mr. Vishwas' integration into the Tulsi household after his marriage to Shama. She is a member of the Tulsi family. The dynamics within this Tulsi family, their influence on Mr. Vishwas, and his struggles for independence are the central themes in this chapter. Let's focus on the lines. For the first time in his life, Mr. Vishwas found himself among people who, for all their disorder, acted as a unit. He found the idea alarming and appealing. This passage highlights Mr. Vishwas' initial reaction to the Tulsi family. The contrast between the disorder and unity within the family confuses and fascinates him. Mr. Vishwas has already been an outsider, isolated by his own sense of individuality and misfortune. Tulsis represent a collectivist force that challenge his sense of identity. Both alarming and appealing nature of this unity captures the central conflict of Mr. Vishwas, who faces throughout the novel his desire for independence versus his need for belonging. The house was a barracks. From the kitchen to the long upstairs room, the Tulsi family, in various attitudes of relaxation, was strung out, talking, eating, sewing, nursing babies, reading the Ramayana aloud, laughing, arguing, gossiping. Tulsi House here is depicted as chaotic yet vibrant, filled with activity and life. This vivid description underscores the communal nature of the Tulsi family, where individual spaces and privacy are virtually non existent. Mr. Vishwas, who values his personal space, finds his environment overwhelming and suffocating. The image of the house as a barracks suggests a lack of individuality and the regimentation of life within Tulsi household, foreshadowing Mr. Vishwa's struggles to carve out space for himself. But for the moment he was caught up in the life of the house. There was no way of standing aside, of resisting it. There was no room for reserve. Now, this line talks about the inability to resist the influence of the Tulsi household. The phrase caught up in the life of the house suggests that Tulsi's family collective existence has a gravitational pull that draws in everyone who enters. Mr. Vishwa's desire to maintain a sense of individuality is challenged by the overpowering nature of the Tulsi's environment where personal boundaries are blurred. This reflects a broader theme of the novel, the struggle between individualism and collectivism. He felt himself being drawn into the life of the family, into the succession of little events which make up the life of the Tulsis. He knew, in danger of becoming absorbed, like so many before him. Now, here, Mr. Vishwas recognizes that the danger of losing his identity is already there. The succession of little events symbolize the mundane yet pervasive influence of the family on its members. Mr. Vishwas fears that, like others before him, he will be consumed by the collective identity of the Tulsis, losing his sense of self in the process. This passage emphasizes the theme of existential anxiety and the fear of losing one's individuality within a powerful, dominating social structure. So, how many of you have come across this feeling? How many of you believe that if you are overpowered by your group or a team, you might also lose your individuality? How many of you feel this? Is it a common feeling? It happens. Okay. So, what do you do? Do you plan to stay in that team, or do you try to get a new team where you feel more empowered, or you prefer staying isolated? Isolation. Okay. What are other people's views? So Smita prefers isolation when she believes that she is losing her dualism. Yes, Keshav. All of you may please use the message box if you prefer writing. Your response is important, so you may please prefer writing. Okay. I think Keshav is typing. Fine. So we'll move ahead. Already he was known as Shama's husband, not by his name. It was a warning. Soon he might cease to be Mr. Vishwas at all. This passage poignantly captures Mr. Vishwas' fear of erasure. The fact that he is referred to as Shama's husband rather than by his own name is symbolic of the loss of identity he dreads. Being reduced to a role within the Tulsi family signifies a loss of personal significance and autonomy. In this chapter, Naipal uses the Tulsi family as a metaphor for the oppressive social structures that threaten to subsume individual identity. The Tulsis, with their sprawling, chaotic household, represent the microcosm of post colonial society, where traditional values and communal living clash with the emerging desires for individuality and self determination. We move to chapter 4 now, and the title of the chapter is Chase. In chapter 4, Mr. Vishwas is grappling with life circumstances and his quest for independence. This chapter is important because it focuses on his struggles with his family and his attempts to assert himself amidst the pressure and expectations imposed upon him. Mr. Vishwas conflicts with his extended family members, particularly the Tulsis, keeps on continuing in this chapter. He feels extremely stifled by the dominance and his lack of autonomy. This chapter emphasizes Mr. Vishwas' deep seated desire for a home of his own where he can live his personal freedom and self reliance. Already, Mr. Vishwas faces significant economic difficulties. Now, his financial constraints exacerbate his sense of helplessness and frustration. Let's focus on the important passages of this chapter. Mr. Viswas felt the suffocating pressure of his family's expectations, the constant reminders of his inadequacies and failures. And this line underscores the emotional and the psychological burden Mr. Vishwas carries due to his family's dominance. It highlights this struggle to assert his own identity in a restrictive environment. He looked at the meager savings he had accumulated, the sum that was hardly enough to secure even a modest living, let alone a home of his own. The financial struggles and the limitations that are imposed on his ability to achieve his dreams. This is what the passage illustrates. It talks about the economic barriers that contribute to his sense of frustration. In his mind, the image of his house, small and humble, became a beacon of hope, a symbol of freedom and respect. So we see him manifesting his house, maybe small and humble, but that would definitely be giving him a hope and a symbol of freedom and self respect that he's yearning since so long. The weight of social expectations bore down on him, a constant reminder of his failure to meet the standards set by those around him. Now, this passage addresses the social pressures Mr. Vishwas faces, contributing to his sense of inadequacy and frustration. It reflects the social expectations that shapes one's life and decisions. Despite his dreams of a better life, Mr. Vishwas found himself trapped in a cycle of poverty and dependence, his aspirations seeming more distant with each passing day. This line talks about his aspirations and his harsh reality. He is trapped, he cannot come out of it. There is there is a yearning, although, but he's helpless, he's miserable, he just cannot help himself come out of this because he has to stay with the family as of now because he has not enough financial gains as yet that would help him give a better life. So we see there is a lot of themes associated in this chapter. There is economic hardships, There is loss of identity, loss of self respect. And the author here is poignant enough to comment on the complexities of self assertions in a challenging socio-economic landscape. Chapter 5, Green Whale, titled Green Whale. Chapter 5 evolves circumstances as he tries to establish his own identity and gain independence from the oppressive influence of the Tulsis. It talks about Green Whale, the chapter talks about the conflict with the Tulsis, where Mr. Vishwa's dissatisfaction with his life grows. The chapter introduces Green Whale, a new setting that represents a potential escape for Mr. Vishwas. The chapter also talks about the personal struggle, both personal and professional, where he finds himself grappling within the feelings of inadequacy and his inability to break free from the Tulsi's hold. The chapter also talks about hope and ambition. Despite the hardships, Mr. Vishwas remains hopeful, and also the family dynamics, the complex dynamics between Mr. Vishwas and his family members, particularly with his wife and children. The description of Mr. Vishwas' dissatisfaction with his current living situation sets the stage for his desire to green whale. Now, this line illustrates his yearning for the independence and his struggle against the controlling nature of the Tulsi. Mr. Vishwas' reflection on green whale highlight his hope and ambition, emphasizes his vision of a better life and his determination to overcome the obstacles. The interactions between Mr. Vishwas and his family talks about the internal conflicts he faces. The depiction of green whale as a symbol of freedom and self-assertion is a key moment in the chapter. This passage illustrates how Mr. Vishwas views the property as a means to achieve his dreams and escape his current situation. So, in this chapter, we find Vishwas offering a profound exploration and how green whale acts as a symbolism and depicts individualism and the quest for self identity, highlighting his resilience and determination to create a better life for himself. We take a break here with chapter 5. We start with chapter 6 in the next part of this session. Let's resume. So, before the break, we completed 5 chapters. This is the sixth chapter that we are going to continue now. Chapter number 6, a departure. Chapter 6, titled Departure, focuses on the significant developments in Mr. Vishwa's life as he navigates through his complex relationships, personal struggles, and the ongoing quest for independence. This chapter marks a turning point where Mr. Vishwas makes critical decisions that further define his character and his journey towards self reliance. Some of the important lines in this chapter: the thought of leaving the Tulsi's house filled him with both fear and relief. He longed to escape the oppressive environment. Yet the uncertainty of life outside was terrifying. This is a very natural feeling. This excerpt captures the ambivalence that Mr. Vishwas feels about leaving the Tulsi household, the Tulsi family that represented control, oppression, and the stifling of his individuality. However, it also offers a semblance of security. That part was also there. His conflicting emotions reflect his internal struggle between the desire for freedom and the fear of the unknown. The author uses this tension to highlight Mr. Vishwa's ongoing battle between dependence and the urge to carve out his own identity. In the darkness of the small room, Mr. Vishwas felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. The walls seemed to close in, and he knew that he could not continue living in this way. The imagery in this passage is powerful, with the words darkness and small room that symbolize Mr. Vishwa's entrapment and feelings of confinement. The weight of the world suggests the overwhelming pressure he faces, both from his external circumstances and his internal dissatisfaction. This moment of realization is pivotal as it represents Mr. Vishwa's recognition that he cannot remain passive and must take to change his life. Naipul here uses this imagery to emphasize the psychological burden that Mr. Vishwas carries and his need for liberation. I asked a question to all of you: what is emotional healing? Do you think now that he's deciding to step out, he would receive emotional healing? Now that he's looking forward to his self identity that he had been yearning for so long, do you think now he would be receiving the emotional healing? But he's also unsure of the unknown. What about that part? What about that part? Because he's also uncertain about the future. He doesn't know how the future would be. Here he was at least getting a security. He doesn't know what will happen in the upcoming times. Will he still receive emotional healing? If you say the answer is yes, I would want you to write a reason that even after moving away or even after being unknown to the uncertainties, there would be emotional healing. I want you to write down the answer here. Yearning and actually happening what he wants may be different. Absolutely, Yukti. It may take time, but he will heal emotionally eventually. Okay, good. Let's proceed. Let's see. Leaving the house was not just a physical act, it was a symbolic rejection of everything that had held him back. This is such a beautiful line. When you are done with a certain thing and you want to move ahead in your life, you are not simply leaving behind the people or let's say the house, but you are actually rejecting everything that had held you back, and you are choosing to live a life of your own. That's exactly, so that's the reason why I'm saying Naipur's writings are self-reflective. They're very relatable. Leaving the house was not just a physical act, it was a symbolic rejection of everything that had held him back. It was an assertion of his right to live as he chose. This passage underscores the symbolic significance of Mr. Vishwa's decision to leave the Tulsi house. The departure is not merely about physical relocation, it also represents a profound shift in his mindset. By rejecting the environment that has oppressed him, Mr. Vishwas here is asserting his autonomy and his right to self determination. His act of defiance is crucial in his journey towards self realization, and the author Naipul uses it to illustrate the broader theme of individual freedom versus societal constraints. Even as he packed his few belongings, doubt gnawed at him. Was he making a mistake? Would he be able to survive on his own? Now, this line is giving the kind of the deep-seated insecurities that Mr. Vishwas has and the persistent self-doubt that plagues him. The act of packing his belongings is symbolic of the preparation for a new life, yet it is accompanied by uncertainty. This internal conflict highlights the theme of vulnerability and the fear of failure that often accompanies the pursuit of independence. Naipul here captures the universal human experience of facing the unknown and the anxiety that it entails. As he stepped out of the house, the cool evening air hit his face, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of possibility of a future that belonged to him alone. Such a beautiful line, and such a, a beacon of hope this line gives ahead so clearly. This line not only marks a moment of liberation for Mr. Vishwas, but also the words that are used, cool evening air, that tells about the fresh start or maybe a break from the stifling atmosphere of the Tulsi house. The sense of possibility here reflects Mr. Vishwas' newfound hope and the potential of a life that he can shape according to his own desires. Naipal uses this moment to convey the idea that true freedom comes with the courage to step into the unknown despite the risk involved. It's a turning point that signifies Mr. Vishwa's transition from a life of subjugation to one of autonomy. This is the end of chapter 6. Chapter 6, here we understand how the author delves into the theme of independence, identity, and the struggle for self determination. Through Mr. Vishwa's internal conflict and eventual departure from the Tulsi's house, Naipul explores the complexities of breaking free from the oppressive environment and the psychological toll it had taken on him. Overall, chapter 6 is a critical point in the novel, and from here we start with part 2. We start with part 2 here. This is the next chapter under part 2, and the title is Amazing Scenes. The chapter Amazing Scenes here marks a critical transition in Mr. Vishwa's life as he navigates his new realities and challenges. He's free now, he's free from the Tulsi's house, he's free the way he wanted to. In this chapter, we see the impact of his decision and how those decisions are also impacting the people around him. And this chapter portrays Mr. Vishwa's disillusionment with his situation and his constant struggle to establish his own identity and a sense of belonging. In this chapter, we see there are still a lot of complexities. After his marriage, establishment of his household, he begins to confront the stark realities of his existence. His dreams of independence and success seems increasingly elusive as he faces challenges from across. Let's focus on the lines. Let's see what all major tensions are still ahead in his life. Mr. Viswas watched the green, damp grass of the garden, the tropical flowers, the grandeur of the house. He felt an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. Now, this passage captures Mr. Vishwa's feelings of inadequacy and how he's feeling different in his surrounding, despite the external beauty of his new environment. He still struggles internally, reflecting on his failure to live up to his own expectations. The lush imagery contrasts with his emotional turmoil, emphasizes his disconnection from his own aspirations. His conversations with his wife became strained. They argued over trivial matters, but the underlying issues were more profound. Now we see that Mr. Vishwas' marriage is in a very strained condition. It reveals deeper conflicts that are not just about the daily inconveniences but about the fundamental issues of compatibility and expectations. It underscores the theme of personal dissatisfaction affecting relationship and the difficulty of maintaining harmony when personal dreams remain unfulfilled. Mr. Vishwas wandered through the rooms, feeling the weight of each object as a reminder of his failure to make his own mark. This line shows Mr. Vishwas' growing frustration with his material possessions, which he views as a symbol of his failure rather than success. The physical environment becomes a metaphor for his internal struggle, reflecting the tension between his aspiration and his reality. The family gatherings were a constant reminder of his outsider status. So here we see, although being an outsider to his own family, which highlights his being an outsider and the difficulty he faces in establishing his place within the social structure. In this chapter, Naipul appears to be into delving into the complexities of Mr. Vishwa's internal and external conflicts. He still feels there is an alienation, there is an isolation, internal struggle still goes on, and the vivid imagery here Mr. Vishwas sees or feels are the state of his emotions and the broader themes of identity and personal fulfillment. The next chapter, the new regime. In the next chapter, we see Mr. Vishwas transition from the turmoil of his previous life to a phase under the control. Here, the chapter begins with Mr. Vishwas coming to terms with his diminished autonomy and the shifting power dynamics in his life. He feels increasingly isolated and he had been trying really hard. He's been adjusting really hard. His frustration is evident. He is still under economic and social constraints. He is still trying hard to make a decision. He is back and forth conflicted with his internal life and external pressures. There is social isolation. The role that he ought to be playing in his life of taking over the control is still not seen favorable. The next chapter is Short Hill's adventure. In Short Hill's adventure, we see V.S. Naipaul taking the story ahead to explore more challenges and complexities. I want all of you to recall what the Pandit in the beginning of the birth of Mohan Vishwas claimed that he is born in the wrong way, in the wrong time. So much of challenges and complexities, and in all these chapters, we have seen that the challenges and the complexities faced by the protagonist is just never ending. His pursuit of autonomy still continues, and right now, Mr. Vishwas experiences the Short Hills estate, which represents another attempt at establishing his independence and a fight with difficulties. The house at Short Hills was huge with an air of decay. It seemed to have been built for something grander than the Tulsi family, whose large numbers now made it seem crowded and chaotic. This excerpt captures the irony of Mr. Vishwa's situation. The Short Hills house, though large and seemingly grand, is in a state of decay, symbolizing the failure of the Tulsi family's grand ambitions. The grandeur of the house contrasts sharply with the reality of the Tulsi family's chaotic and overcrowded life within it. For Mr. Vishwas, the house represents both a dream of independence and the harsh reality of his entanglement. However, the decaying structure here reflects the crumbling dreams of the hollowness structure of the aspirations in the characters. In the first week at Short Hills, Mr. Vishwas tried to adapt to a new environment, but the isolation and the sheer emptiness of the estate began to weigh heavily on him. Mr. Vishwas struggled to adapt to Short Hills, underscore his perpetual sense of displacement again and his inability to find a true home. The emptiness of the estate mirrors the emptiness Mr. Vishwas feels in his life despite his ongoing quest. He is continually confronted with environments that isolate him rather than fulfill him. The Tulsi family, ever resourceful, began to turn the estate into a sort of collective farm which each family member assigned a plot of land to cultivate. This passage reveals the resilience and the adaptability of the Tulsi family. Since they are family, so there is a constant sharpness. Mr. Vishwas' individualistic aspirations have brought into the forefront. The collective farming effort at Short Hills represents the communal approach to life, where individual desires are subsumed under the needs of the family. Mr. Vishwas begins to dream of leaving Short Hills, of starting anew, but each day he found himself more deeply enmeshed in the life of the estate, as if it had a hold on him that he could not break. This continues, this entire chapters, they continue where we see there is difficulty in finding personal autonomy, and there is a restrictive social structure wherever he goes. The life struggles keep on jumping towards him, highlighting the persistent challenges he faces. The author clearly emphasizes the theme of entrapment, both physical and psychological, and he often also speaks about the elusive nature of freedom and independence. The next chapter, among the readers and learners. The chapter opens with Mr. Biswaj at a stage in his life where he is keen on advancing his education and intellectual standing. His desire to rise above his previous circumstances and gain respect in a more educated circle becomes more apparent. Mr. Vishwas' interactions with his intellectual peers are central here in this chapter. We see deeper into Mr. Vishwas' life as he becomes more immersed in the world of intellectuals and readers. The chapter showcases Mr. Vishwas' attempts to engage in intellectual discussions and his effort to educate himself. His ambition to be recognized as a learned person is palpable, yet he struggles with the practicalities of gaining true knowledge and acceptance. Even here, we see there are internal and external conflicts as he navigates his intellectual space. His experiences reflect a deeper struggle with his identity and the disparity between his ambitions and his reality. By the end of the chapter, Mr. Vishwas' journey among readers and learners reveals both his progress and his limitations. Mr. Vishwas felt a sense of inadequacy as he listened to the discussions around him. The ease with which others spoke of literature and politics made him feel his own ignorance even more acutely. This passage highlights Mr. Vishwas' feelings of inadequacy, his self awareness, and the contrast between his knowledge and that of others emphasize his struggle with more self doubt and his desire to bridge the gap between himself and his intellectual peers. Although he tried to contribute to conversations, but his words seemed clumsy and out of place. The others responded with polite nods, but Mr. Vishwas could sense their underlying indifferences. How Mr. Vishwas' efforts to fit in and his subsequent failure to do so is the main illustration of this line. We see the indifferences from others for his outside status and the difficulties he faces in gaining true acceptance. In his solitude, Mr. Viswas read voraciously, hoping that knowledge might be a key to the respect he so desperately sought. Yet, every book seemed to deepen his isolation rather than alleviate it. Mr. Vishwa's reading reflects his intense desire for self improvement and respect that he always had yearned. The fact that reading deepens his isolation rather than helping him integrate underscores the theme of his ongoing struggle with belonging and self worth. Critically, if you go to evaluate this particular chapter, you would see Naipal's portrayal of Mr. Vishwa's experiences among intellectuals serving to illustrate the protagonist, both internal and external conflicts. Naipal delves into the themes of identity, social mobility, intellectual aspirations, highlighting the gap between Mr. Vishwa's desires and his realities. We see there is a theme of identity and self worth, a struggle with his identity and self worth. We see there is social mobility, the challenges of the social mobility and the barriers faced by individuals as a theme. The search, the quest for belonging is a central to this chapter. Mr. Vishwas struggled to integrate into a world of readers and learners, reflects his broader search for a place where he feels accepted and valued. We move to the next chapter, The Void. The Void delves into Mr. Vishwa's continued struggle with his sense of inadequacy. The chapter explores more as he grapples with his personal identity and societal pressures. The chapter highlights Mr. Vishwa's growing disillusionment with his life. He feels increasingly trapped in his circumstances, particularly within the constraints of the relationships that are tied around him. He thought of his failures, how he had tried to change things and had only made them worse. His life was full of attempts that had come to nothing. There is an introspection here, there is a regret here, there is a frustration here, and how he feels about his inability to prove his situation despite all his efforts. He feels trapped, he feels like a small insect caught in a web, he feels helpless, he is dissatisfied, and there is a contemplation of his own existence. He wondered if he would ever escape this void, or if it was his destiny to remain in this state of perpetual dissatisfaction. There is an examination of failure in this particular chapter. He focuses on the thematic exploration. He talks about existentialism, where he is in a search for meaning, for a purpose of his life. He is dissatisfied with his life, which represents a deeper existential crisis. There is a family pressure, there is isolation, and emotional and existential void. This is the central to the narrative, reflecting the broader theme of personal struggle against the constraints. Last but one chapter, the revolution. Mr. Vishwas finds himself in a revolutionary change taking place in Trinidad and in his own life. The chapter delves into the socio political upheavals affecting the island, particularly focusing on the cultural shifts that challenge traditional values and status quo. Mr. Vishwa's personal struggles mirror the larger societal transformations He faces significant challenges, including his strained relationship with his family and his own sense of identity and purpose. This chapter intricately weaves Mr. Vishwa's personal turmoil with the broader societal revolution. It portrays how the political and social changes impacts his life, the frustration of not achieving the stability he yearns, Mr. Vishwa's interactions with his family, the conflicts with his in-laws, his struggle to assert independence, these are all going to perhaps end soon. The streets were full of people shouting slogans, waving flags, and the sounds of drums filled the air. This passage vividly describes the atmosphere of political agitation and revolution in Trinidad. It captures the sense of upheaval and the collective desire for change. Imagery of people shouting slogans and waving flags illustrates the public engagement in the revolutionary fervor. Mr. Vishwas watched the scenes with a mixture of envy and dismay. He wanted to be a part of the change but felt powerless. This excerpt reflects Mr. Vishwas' internal conflict, his desire to be the part of the revolution, contrast with his feelings of alienation. It underscores his struggle to find his own place in a rapidly changing world. His wife and children seemed more concerned with their own problems, leaving him to navigate the chaos alone. The excerpt here highlights the disintegration of family support in Mr. Vishwa's life, lacks of solidarity that his immediate family is unable to provide, the sense of vulnerability that he is feeling right now, he is trapped in. The old ways were being questioned. Mr. Vishwas found himself at odds with the new values being embraced by the younger generation. There is a discomfort here with the cultural shifts, the old and the new paradigms in the Trinidadian society. He dreamed of a house of his own, a sanctuary from the turmoil outside. But every attempt to build his dream seemed thwarted by external forces. The socio-political upheavals on individuals' life, this is what the chapter is exploring. Naipul critiques the disorienting effects of the cultural revolutions, how it brings isolation and the lack of fulfillment in people's life. The last chapter, the house. Mr. Vishwas finally manages to acquire a house for his family, marking a significant milestone in his struggle for personal independence. The chapter delves into the complexities of the process, the symbolic significance, the dynamics of Mr. Vishwa's relationship with his family and wider community. The chapter portrays Mr. Vishwa's excitement and anxiety as he moves into the house. The house represents more than just a physical structure. It is a symbol of Mr. Vishwa's quest for autonomy and self worth. Mr. Vishwa's interactions with his family and local community reflect his ongoing struggle for respect and recognition. However, his pride in owning the house is fruitful finally. The house was a small rectangular building with a narrow veranda and a small garden. It was not as grand as he had hoped, but it was his. This line highlights the modesty of Mr. Vishwa's achievement. Despite all struggles, the house right now he is stepping inside and trying to make a home symbolizes his personal triumph and his desire to assert his independence. He imagined the house as a place of freedom, and this is where he finds significant achievement. Mrs. Biswas was not as thrilled as he expected. She kept worrying about the financial burden and the upkeep. This line illustrates the tension between Mr. Vishwa's aspirations and the practical concerns of his family. They have neighbors now who were polite but distant. They treated him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. This line clearly states Mr. Vishwa's position in the community. Despite finally owning the house, he still remains an outsider, struggling to gain acceptance and respect from those around him. Mr. Vishwas stood in the doorway looking out at the street. The house seemed to hold all his hopes and fears within its walls. This moment captures the symbolic weight of the house. It represents Mr. Vishwas' hopes for a better future and his fears of failure, embodying the dual nature of his achievement. Naipal here uses the house as a powerful symbol of Mr. Vishwa's quest for self assertion. The house reflects both his achievements and his limitations, illustrating the complexities of his life. Thematic exploration of identity, autonomy, isolation, belongingness, disillusionment, realism, all of them captures the entire chapters where we see there is still a lot of gap between Mr. Vishwa's dreams and the harsh realities of his life. The house becomes a source of new challenges, illustrating the theme of although identity and autonomy, but still the theme of disillusionment. So here we come to the end of the novel A House for Mr. Vishwas by V.S. Naipul. Yukti, would you want to ask me the question again? Because I see it's long time you had asked this. Can you please repeat the line, ma'am? Which line, Yukti, would you want to focus on? Okay, and you're talking about the place where he was standing looking at the streets. Okay, can you mention me the chapter name probably that would help? Chapter 7 would be the last part, yes. So, yes, the last chapter where he is, uh, still looking forward to receive the respect or identity because he is looking forward to the streets, and there are people, there are neighbors who are looking him with, you know, a kind of feeling of skepticism, where there is this anxiousness to go communicate with a new person in the neighborhood. So there is still a kind of there is a self reflection here, that besides despite all his struggles the entire life, finally he got a house where he is free, but still now there are some new set of constraints. Okay, yes. Oh, so Shri Smita is asking, where can we find the recordings of all the classes? I think it would be with the office. You may please contact the office. So overall, what do you think? He finally found a new home, a new house, but why still there is this gap there? What do you think like that? Was he true to his feelings when he left the Tulsi house to delve into the uncertainties? Was he ready for the uncertainties that were waiting for him? So, what do you think? What are your views? You may please write down. Why there is still a gap of dissatisfaction, even if he is in his own house, although there is freedom, the thing that he always wanted. He wanted it his whole life, but was not ready for the challenges that came across. Was not very sure about the uncertainties. That is why he was quite skeptical about his decision. Okay. But do you think he will be happy in his new home? Do you think he's happy there? He'll get used to the surrounding after some time. Okay, then we stop here. Maybe he will be happy. Yeah, okay. Okay, then we stop here for today. We meet again tomorrow. We have a new chapter waiting. We discuss, and yeah, we begin sharp at 6. Thank you, all of you, for today. Yes, Yukti, you're correct. The sense of alienation still persists. Maybe as time lapses, he accepts it and lives with it. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, people, all of you.